Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, he works part-time in a hardware store. He's retired from several other careers, but continues to enjoy helping people in a retail service environment. And recently, he kindly gave me, as we were talking about gardening, some hosta plants that he had grown. And as I drove to his neighborhood looking for his house, I suspected his home was the one flying the large American flag. I knew that Mike, my friend, had served in Vietnam, but as we spent some time digging up the plants and visiting around his garden, I learned a lot more about his harrowing experience as a Marine. You see, Mr. Speaker, Mike's squad was assigned to protect an area in the northern part of South Vietnam. They were a pesky bunch, as Mike put it, and the North Vietnamese, they grew tired of the constant haranguing, so they launched a counter-assault. Mike's squad was outnumbered 10-1, and they were hit pretty hard. A call went out for help, but the first helicopter to arrive was blown apart. Mike sustained severe wounds. A bullet to the chest collapsed his lung. Shrapnel tore through a foot and his leg, and another bullet grazed his head. To breathe, Mike had to keep clearing his throat with his finger to remove the gurgling blood. And at the point where he could no longer physically fight, he crawled to a slightly more secure place and propped himself up on a sack. Mike told me he remembered two things: the wind blowing through his hair and his mother, who would tell her that he had died. Only 3 Americans survived that battle. But fortunately, another helicopter quickly landed, and a corpsman came to Mike's rescue, stabilized him, and helped return him to safety. A doctor performed quick and precision surgery, and the medical personnel nursed him back to health, for which Mike was always grateful. But something always nagged him. He never got a chance to thank the corpsman who risked his own life to save him. And finally, in 2001, he went online and did some research and found the man 30 years later, and Mike wrote to him and said, "I have not forgotten you." Now, Mr. Speaker, it's no secret that our country's economic, political, and cultural settlement is straining under a number of very harsh realities. Concentration of economic and political power, coupled with signs of social collapse, are contributing to a growing sense of vulnerability and anxiety in our society. Amid a divisive and disorienting political season, terrorist attacks in San Bernardino, Orlando, Minnesota, and New York have reminded us of the grave threats to life and our cherished liberties. But take a moment, Mr. Speaker, to notice how many Nebraskans and how many Americans like Mike fly our flag. It means something. The flag stands for an ideal, for a value, for the proposition that all persons have dignity. And when that dignity is safeguarded, a people can flourish. That's America. But I think more people need to hear, Mr. Speaker, that we've not forgotten you. And the fundamental questions right now before us are, who are we as a nation? Where are we going as a people? How will we find our greatness again? Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I had an extraordinary privilege. I'd like to share the story with you and the body. I was invited to attend a dedication of a new Veterans Memorial in a small town in the heart of the Great Plains, north of Lincoln, Nebraska, where I live. This town is called Wahoo. It was actually made famous because in the old David Letterman show, he named it as the hometown office. But Wahoo is more than a late-night show's joke. It is a place where a community lives, works, and has a deep sense of interconnectedness and well-being. It is a place of extraordinary greatness. In this small town, about 500 people from the entire county came and gathered right there at the courthouse for this dedication of the new memorial, honoring the 101 service members who have been killed from that small farming community in the surrounding area. Soldiers, troops, military personnel from World War I to our present day. And all of their names were read in an honor roll, many having Czech and German names, who were such an important part of the original settlement of that area, as well as the Swedish. When I approached the microphone to say words, I recalled the old movie To Kill a Mockingbird, based upon the old novel. And Mr. Speaker, as you will recall, in that movie, the lawyer, Atticus Finch, gives a defense of a man who is unjustly accused of a crime. The community from which that man had come had to sit in the upper balcony of the courtroom because of the prejudice of that time. And as Atticus Finch was getting ready to leave the courtroom, the reverend who was in the midst of that community in the gallery says to his young child, the lawyer's young child, "Stand up, your father is passing." At that beautiful ceremony right there in the Great Plains, it started with the public high school choir and the Catholic high school choir singing our national anthem. And when that occurred, no one sat on a bench. No one took a knee. We all stood. Because it was not about us. It was about them, the men and women before us, living and dead, who had answered the call to service. And whether they had cooked or cleaned or computed or were in the worst conceivable firefight, nonetheless, they said, "Yes, I will serve. I will sacrifice for the meaning of our nation." We live in a time, Mr. Speaker, when our world is screaming for meaning. What we're searching for is not an answer that can be found here in this body. We have an important role to debate the most pressing issues of the day, whether those are national security, economic security, and even cultural security. The most important answers aren't found necessarily down the street in the White House. They're not going to be answered necessarily in the great debate that's about to occur moments from now on the television. The answer is found in the debate about meaning itself. When we find things that bind us, like this extraordinary ceremony yesterday, nestled in the heart of America, where people, young and old, came to honor our veterans. When we look back to those who came before us, giving them their due in a memorial that appropriately honors them, we bind ourselves in a noble ideal that sacrifice for one another, sacrifice even for a nation, is sometimes not only necessary, but it is worthy of the fullness of the call in the human heart. But we still have hard questions before us. So what should we do? The first pathway, Mr. Speaker, to finding solutions is to adequately identify the problem. And in one word, I believe the problem is fragmentation. What do I mean by that? It is a creeping separateness, whether in economic affairs, government affairs, foreign affairs, or our own basic exchanges in local community life. People are feeling alone, isolated. In many cases, they feel like they lack control over the most basic things, the simple things in their own life. Far remote systems seem to be the new governing order. The formative institutions that used to provide the continuity of tradition and nest people into an ongoing desire and pathway toward hope by giving them the gifts of that tradition and the responsibility nested within community, as well as the accountability, have all become fragmented. These burdens press upon our people in a most profound way, and in particular in regards to their own economic well-being. These days, economic measures are on everyone's mind. There's a tremendous amount of anxiety, even hopelessness in our uncertain times. And while the stock market has certainly rebounded and corporate profits have soared, many families are facing downward mobility, stagnant wages, decreased opportunity, the feeling of disenfranchisement, the inability to achieve financial security. And part of our problem is our country's damaged micro enterprise sector, that entrepreneurial space where most new jobs in the country are actually created. And we're not even talking about corporations that are 100 to 500 employees. We're talking about shops that are 1 to 5 people. This morning I made a phone call as I was getting on the plane to return here from Nebraska because Mr. Speaker, I'd received this in the mail. There's a flyer announcing a doors closing sale from a small business called Havelock. This furniture company anchors the north end of a little community called Havelock, which is now subsumed into the greater community of Lincoln, Nebraska. And it distressed me when I received this. At first I thought they might be another victim of corporate consolidation and inability to compete as a small furniture store in a sector that might be, again, increasing the concentration into fewer and fewer hands. So I just picked up the phone and I called Sue. Now, this is an advertisement for a closing business sale, and it's giving me a discount if I want to come there and buy something. But Sue lays out in very heartfelt terms the reality of their circumstances. The family has been in business for 61 years, and now I'm retiring forever, she goes on to say. And I'm offering our friends and employees and preferred customers a special discount. Well, I can't ever recall if I've met Sue. And by the way, at the top of this, Mr. Speaker, I don't know if you can see it, is a picture of the founder, Mel Everson, and it says in loving memory. And as I recall, Sue is his daughter. I called Sue just to find out what was going on and also to express my thanks for their willingness to be in business this long, carry on an important tradition for an important part of our town, be an integrated part of an old Main Street that still occupies a unique part of the community where I live. And we talked a little bit about what happened, and fortunately, it wasn't the result of any type of pressure coming from outside economic forces that were beyond her control. It was simply the necessary decision that had to be made for family reasons. But nonetheless, I felt a heartfelt loss. And why? Because on a deeper level, Sue's business is the loss of a symbol of community mutuality in economic affairs, a gathering place where human interaction reinforces social vibrancy. Mr. Speaker, our country needs a 21st century vision of what economic success can look like. Benign competition with a robust small business sector creates the conditions for a sustainable dynamism. A humane economy that prioritizes personal relationships and community ties fosters stronger entrepreneurialism and forges better consumer products and creates more jobs for persons who need them. Just as a healthy society and the principle of self-responsibility are the preconditions for prosperity, properly ordered markets support social cohesion. Markets at their best are driven by startup innovation and sustained by widespread ownership. The return of small business with a new participatory economy can extend the dignity and just rewards of meaningful work. It will help us fight poverty and help us to rebuild our economy in this century. Now, what are some good examples of this economic mutuality I'm referring to, where no person or no thing is thrown away? I recently saw a presentation by a CEO of a major corporation. Now, he threw up a PowerPoint on the screen, and I thought we were getting ready to look at some boring quarterly earnings projections or something like that. But instead of rolling out the PowerPoints and graphs, the CEO showed a simple picture. It was a picture of a young woman on her wedding day, a bride on her father's arm. And the CEO then said this: everyone is someone's daughter. Everyone is someone's son. In other words, persons matter. Persons matter in a society. Persons matter in a business. Persons matter as we debate the great public policy issues before us, because ultimately that is the purpose, the well-being of persons. The point was powerfully made. The understanding of work and the workplace, the proper understanding of work as nested within the workplace, are essential to human dignity and human happiness. And this CEO of a very large corporation said he believed business could be the greatest force for good in the world. That's a strong and proper perspective. Mr. Speaker, as I was recently looking around my garage, looking to clean out a few things, I came upon an old, antiquated pickaxe. It's really a substantial piece of hardware. I bought this years ago and used it a number of times in my yard. And then the handle finally broke, and I had a hard time throwing it away. It's a bad habit I have, I guess. But it sat there in my garage, a substantial piece of iron. So instead of throwing it away, I took it with me to the local hardware store. And then I went to look at some new ones, and I asked the clerk, I said, "What do you think? Do you sell handles?" He said, "No, we don't sell new handles." He said, "You're probably better off buying a new one and putting this one on the wall in the man cave." So I went and looked at a new one and toyed with the idea. But then the clerk said, "Well, look, let me do a little research for you, and I'll get back to you." So he did. He went out and found a company in America that made pickaxe handles out of hickory. He took it a little further. He went ahead and ordered the handle for me, replaced it himself, and when I went into the store about a week later, there it was. A piece of old hardware ready to be put back to work with a replacement handle proudly made in America, made of hickory. Now, if you had done a straight analysis of the cost involved in this repair project, it wasn't worth it. I only saved about $10 by repairing versus buying a new one. I had to wait a week or so, and I had to go to the store twice. But there are unmeasured benefits here. Let's talk about those. First of all, an old piece of iron is not in a landfill. A renewable resource of hickory wood was deployed. An American company made a little profit. And the hardware store clerk had the satisfaction of a hand-built opportunity. I tell you, I must say I'm pretty proud of my refreshed, repurposed pickaxe. And I put it right to work on some old bushes I had in the yard. More importantly, Mr. Speaker, if we are going to rebuild our economy, thinking about how we manufacture, how we maintain, and how we rebuild what is still useful can unlock the benefits of a well-functioning market system. This small act of taking something old but and getting it back into useful service provides some insights on how to better secure economic well-being. The disposable nature of so many goods as they are now manufactured, with the intended life expectancy ever more narrow, decreases costs in the short term. But cheaper isn't always best. The ability to repair and recycle and to repurpose to keep the useful life of a resource as long as possible is smart economics. It's a fundamental principle of conservation, and it's a key to reviving the small business service sector. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, this is an emerging trend. I was watching the Olympics, and during it I noticed a commercial where a major retailer gave a subtle message about cheap imports. During the commercial, as the song Dream On built up steadily in the background, the commercial featured people waking up, going about the routine of life, getting their kids to school, and making their way to a factory where they used their hands to make things. Tough and gritty work, but connected to a deeper meaning. At the end of the commercial, the company stated it will invest $250 billion in American manufacturing in the years to come. Maybe we are on the front end of a trend, Mr. Speaker. I certainly hope so. An economic model that chases more and more output alone is not a valid measure of value. Our country's economic reboot requires a return to a humane economy focused on quality, durability, and the work of human hands, and as much as we can made in America. Without this focus, we will forever chase that which we cannot find. And perhaps more and more people are realizing that we should shift to what is dependable, not disposable, what is fixable, not forgettable, what is repairable, and not just replaceable. Using my repurposed hickory-handled American-made pickaxe gives me a great deal of time to think about these things, Mr. Speaker. It also gives me a pretty good workout, a winner all the way around. Mr. Speaker, I want to reference something else that I happened to see. There's a show, I'm not sure if it's still on, but it's called Undercover Boss, and I've seen it a few times. I find the program to be quite engaging and very, very human. The premise of the show is that the CEO, the chief executive officer of a major company, goes undercover as an employee. And then from there, they participate in the gritty work of building things, of cleaning up, working the phones, and performing basic administrative tasks. During this particular episode that I saw, the boss spent some time out in the field repairing a broken sewer line. Then he was in an office answering calls and at a manufacturing plant where the equipment was crafted. The CEO was assigned to one of the company's top welders for training at the manufacturing facility. As part of his disguise, he wore safety glasses and a do-rag. The first mistake that the CEO made was burning a hole through the metal that he was supposed to be joining. After the welder who was supervising him gently corrected his technique, they took a break where the conversation turned to job security. The middle-aged welder, who was a long-time dedicated employee and team leader at that corporation, told the boss about the worry that he has and that he overhears at the manufacturing plant. Would they just show up one day and see a closed sign hanging on the cyclone fence? Given what's going on in America, no one knows for sure whether the company would just pack up, move overseas, like so many others have. This simple conversation in the break room in Middle America captured what so many Americans are justifiably concerned about. Now, although the government's aggregate statistics show an overall unemployment rate at about 5%, the numbers hide a disturbing reality. For too many people, the rhetoric of free markets has not translated into better opportunity or security. As I mentioned, stagnant wages and downward mobility, staggering student loan debt, job insecurity, and the increased cost of living are all real difficulties making the new normal for an increased number of families in our society. Now, in another segment of the television show, the disguised CEO had to work on a home drainage system. The elderly woman who lived in the well-kept but very simple house was told that the bill to fix the problem was $1,200. She responded in a very worried voice about her many doctor bills and how much medicine she had to buy. The employee supervising the CEO then paused, considered the situation, and gently spoke to the elderly woman and said to her, "Well, how about $500? The employee, as it turns out, had took it upon himself to cut his own commission in order to help this elderly, vulnerable person, all while his undercover boss watched. After several other meaningful encounters with his employees, the show concluded with the CEO revealing his true identity and commending everyone with whom he had interacted. He made some poignant points about his experiences, how deeply they had touched his life, and how they would now impact his management style. To the welder, he said, "I want you to take the message back. We are staying in America. Give them that assurance from me." To the man who reduced the bill at the cost of his own salary, he rewarded him for his compassion and dedication. Business can be a force for great good, Mr. Speaker. The true potential of companies depend upon their people for their greatness. In this case, the CEO was willing to do a self-evaluation of his own leadership style and the very fundamental purpose of the company itself. Perhaps a scorecard should be kept to feature businesses that do the right thing, trying to keep the best jobs in America, consistently innovating, and paying just salaries to persons who work hard to support themselves and their families. In order to discover perhaps something about himself, to discover the true meaning of work, to discover the true value of the persons under his authority, the CEO went undercover. And by doing so, he found what he had not seen. A properly functioning market economy genuinely works for both profits and persons, repairing fractures in our society and enhancing community interdependency. That's the point, Mr. Speaker. And community interdependency is the true source of our nation's strength. Mr. Speaker, when I was a much younger man, I owned a rear-wheel drive Ford Bronco 2. They don't make them anymore. I loved that little truck. I sold it shortly after I was married. That little truck was great for a time in my life, but navigating winter conditions could be a bit tough. One night while traveling on an interstate during really foreboding weather, I came over the crest of a hill. And what lay before me was surreal. It must have happened just seconds before. A large 18-wheeler truck had jackknifed. Cars were spun in every direction, flung into the median. There was a clear sheet of ice that no one had expected. In an instant, my reality changed. In an instant, everything changed. I had to make a choice. I rapidly decreased my speed, gripped the wheel, and focused my total attention on the road before me, only just barely navigating the treachery. Mr. Speaker, many Americans feel that they've been tossed around in a bewildering unpredictability of our current policy, economic, and political dynamics. Many Americans are looking for new leadership that offers a compelling, inspirational, and stable vision that can restore the true security of our nation. And if we so choose, one of the strengths of the American system of government is its capacity for constant replenishment. In the midst of this unpredictable government transition season, it may sound a bit peculiar to speak of opportunity, but could this moment give us the chance, as a people, to reassess and realign? Perhaps so, if we so choose. As we began this conversation, Mr. Speaker, I talked about pointing to the problems in order to understand solutions. I think a stronger America might be glimpsed through 4 mutually supporting principles: government decentralization, economic patriotism, foreign policy realism, and social conservation. Mr. Speaker, just like every football game has 4 quarters, let's think of our solutions as a 4-quarter game plan: government decentralization, economic patriotism, foreign policy realism, and social conservation. What do I mean? First, a return to a more decentralized form of government will restore an important source of America's strength. I in no way wish to belittle the essential, important debates that occur in this body and elsewhere in the federal government. We have a role. We have a role to create the conditions so that the rest of society can flourish. The ultimate role we have is to seek justice and the just structures that can bring about order for persons and communities to flourish. But when the federal government grows beyond its effectiveness, it infringes upon basic liberties. It stifles innovation, and it crushes creativity. And it also takes away the responsibility that we have for one another. A creeping tendency to nationalize every conceivable type of problem erodes community resolve. Now, while the federal government does have a central role in maintaining the guardrails for stability and the rule of law and a fair opportunity economy, America's governing system is designed to operate most effectively at different levels. Those close to an opportunity or a problem ought to have the first authority to seize the opportunity or solve the problem. I find it notable that the Veterans Memorial Ceremony that I went to just yesterday did not include any government funds. It was made up of community resolve and community sacrifice. At this point, Mr. Speaker, I believe the Rules Committee has an announcement that it would like to make, and I'll yield to the gentleman.
I appreciate my friend from yielding. I apologize for interrupting, but Mr. Speaker, I send to the desk 2 privileged reports from the Committee on Rules for filing under the rule.
The clerk will report the text.
Report to accompany House Resolution 892, resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 5303 to provide for improvements to the rivers and harbors of the United States, to provide for the conservation and development of water and related resources and for other purposes, providing for consideration of motions to suspend the rules and waiving a requirement of Clause 6A of Rule 13 with respect to consideration of certain resolutions reported from the Committee on Rules. Report to accompany House Resolution 893, resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 954 to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to exempt from the individual mandate certain individuals who had coverage under a terminated qualified health plan funded through the Consumer Operated and Oriented Plan Co-op program.
refer to the House. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia? Sorry, refer to the House calendar order printed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as a quick civics lesson, as an aside, the Rules Committee in which the gentleman from Georgia sits is still working tonight, trying to craft the structure for the debate that will occur on certain pieces of legislation to come before us in short order. So I understand the dilemma you had in needing to come down here to the floor and interrupt the proceedings appropriately so we can continue the important business of the House. Thank you. Let me return to something I said, Mr. Speaker. Just like every football game has 4 quarters, I believe we ought to think of our solutions as a 4-quarter game plan. And the first is returning to a healthy concept of decentralized government, a healthy federalism where those closest to a responsibility or opportunity have first-order priority in taking responsibility or seizing that opportunity. Again, not to denigrate the very essential role that the federal government plays in creating the conditions for stability and the rule of law and a just playing field, particularly in the economy, as well as national security. But other levels of governance are essential to community well-being. Second, economic inclusion or economic patriotism should help America recover from an arthritic economy. As I mentioned earlier, although the government's aggregate statistics show an unemployment rate at about 5%, these numbers continue to hide certain realities. There is stagnant wages and downward mobility, making life very difficult for a number of families. Mr. Speaker, it's sad to say this, but this Washington-Wall Street axis, which promotes the transnational corporation as the new ruling entity for society, cannot secure the well-being of our economy. They cannot. Instead of a globalized supply-side elitism, America needs a vibrant marketplace of her own that expands the space for constructive interdependency and community dynamism, which will fight poverty and drive innovation, at the heart of which, again, is small business. Small business is the key, along with a fair regulatory environment and the right type of health care reform that will actually end up decreasing cost while protecting vulnerable persons and reset the architecture so that we have a 21st century healthcare system that is truly just, that is fair, that is actually going to achieve the conditions for creativity and innovation in the marketplace. What we have now is a healthcare system that is an increasing drag on the small business sector, and therefore the number of jobs that we see created are going down. We're living in an entrepreneurial winter. The number of jobs being created are less from small businesses, are less than the number of small businesses that are actually dying. We're in an entrepreneurial winter. It's never happened before in the history of our country. So focusing on the small business sector and returning to, again, a fair regulatory environment and appropriately addressing a new architecture for health care, which doesn't simply shift costs, but at its heart, vulnerable persons, improves health care outcomes, and reduces cost, is a key to restoring the small business sector. Third, foreign policy realism. What do I mean? Foreign policy realism charts a course between over-interventionism and isolationism. America has an important role to play on the global stage today. However, many Americans are alarmed at an exhausted, drifting, and often counterproductive foreign policy. The posture of foreign policy adventurism, sometimes coupled with naive assumptions about democracy promotion, requires a recalibration. Leveraging American strength through strategic international relationships and authentic friendships will help us navigate the 21st century, marked by a changing geopolitical framework. Mr. Speaker, I believe in the 3 Ds: strong defense, smart diplomacy, sustainable development. That's the right balance in our foreign policy considerations. Fourth, social conservation. Social conservation provides the conditions for order, opportunity, and happiness. And we don't usually put those two words together, social and conservation. We think of conservation as important protection of our land and water and the air we breathe, not throwing things away unnecessarily. Thinking of the ideals of the ecosystem, where all things are interdependent, or looking out into the vast horizons of nature and letting it pull ourselves to a higher realm of that which is beautiful, even that which is divine. We've all had that experience. We see it. But could we possibly see that? The idea of an ecosystem of community where we actually think that it's more than politics for the promotion of sustainable values. As societies become more fragmented, it is harder and harder for us to craft policies that meet society's needs. Washington cannot spend enough fast enough to fix the deep wounds in our culture, Mr. Speaker. Social conservation recognizes that family life and faith life and civic life provide a continuity of tradition, giving meaning to life and creating stability, particularly for children. Those of us who have had the scarring experience of coming from broken situations, we know this intuitively. Those of us who struggle with the deep scars of having what you know and what keeps you safe torn from you, we know that the formative institutions that preserve the good are invaluable to opportunities later in life. Our sense of well-being, the strength of our nation, ultimately does depend upon the strength of the formative institutions that give rise. Family life and faith life and civic life. That's the strength of America. We are confronting intensifying struggles about the direction of our country. The fault lines are sadly widening. But I think there are things that still bind us. I'd like to think that what I'm saying speaks to every member of Congress here, that it transcends these superficial political boundaries that we set up, that are, yes, based upon a difference of philosophical perspective on the nature of what Washington ought to be and not. But I would like to think, again, that this rises above, because they are binding elements of the human heart. It's what we all long for, to be nested, to be secure within community of loving persons around us, who care enough to hold us accountable, who care enough to demand that we take responsibility for them and with them. Although we are encountering rough weather in our country, we can choose to rediscover this best sense of ourselves. We can choose to rediscover common sense governance, which will uphold these ideals and be built upon them. We can choose right-sized economic models. We can choose to rediscover universal foundational values that are consistent with the desire of all persons' hearts. This is how the greatness can be restored again. This is how we make America great again. This is how we find ourselves and find one another and find a vision that binds us together and makes us all proud to stand as America's flag is flown. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.